Good morning, everybody. If you're here for the Clean Coast Texas Lunch and Learn series, you're in the right spot. Please keep your mic off during the presentation. And if you'd like to keep your camera on, you can, but also, feel free to keep that off. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, just your name and your affiliation. And we'd love to see where everybody's from. And if at any time during the presentation you have questions, feel free to put them in chat. We'll address them at the end during our Q&A section, or if it's something we can address, beforehand by placing a link in there, we'll also do something like that. So just hang on for a few minutes and we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. Before we get started here in a second, just a reminder that if you would like to introduce yourself in chat, please put your name and your affiliation. Please keep your mics on mute during the presentation. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in chat and we will address them during our question and answer section. As we've hit 11 o'clock, we're going to go ahead and get started. Go ahead and introduce Jason Pinchback, our Water Resources Manager at the Texas General Land Office.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, folks. My name is Jason Pinchback. I work in the Coastal Resources Division of the Texas General Land Office. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with us this morning in discussing water quality and resiliency issues here along the Texas coast. If you haven't heard about Clean Coast Texas yet, Let me share a little bit of information with you. We work with coastal communities to facilitate non-regulatory and incentive-based programs and projects to protect and restore water quality, habitat, and shorelines. We support your efforts. Sorry about that. We support your efforts and goals to educate residents, assist in community planning, pursuing and implementing grants, as well as developing drainage and water quality criteria, and build projects that reduce pollution, non-point source pollution along the Texas coast. Clean Coast Texas is an initiative of the Coastal Non-Point Source Pollution Program in Texas and is guided by the Texas General Land Office. We have many different types of services that we provide through Clean Coast Texas, including stormwater retrofit and design, ordinance and stormwater criteria development, community planning, grant funding assistance, partnership development, as well as water quality analysis and citizen science. It's no accident today that we have a great expert with us, with Ms. Katherine Hagemann. And we initially were introduced to her and met her back in 2019 in response to some water quality issues that we were observing along the Texas coastline. We were talking with Ms. Hagemann originally about issues they were seeing in their area related to sea level rise and inundation of local facilities. In Texas, we are aware that there have been many different issues associated with infiltration and inundation, both due to flooding, stormwater, as well as sea level rise. Ms. Katherine Hagemann is the Resilience Program Manager for Adaption within the Office of Resilience at Miami-Dade County. Her work focuses primarily on climate change and adaptation and implementing the county sea level rise strategy. Before moving to Miami, she also worked on coastal climate adaptation during the post-Sandy rebuild by design and national disaster resiliency competitions. She earned her Master of Environmental Science from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Science, where she studied how cities can use hybrid of gray and green infrastructure to adapt to rising sea levels. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Ms. Katherine Hagemann. Please take it away, Katherine.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and hopefully be able to share a couple of slides so you all can see some of the things that we're working on down here. Hopefully my slides look okay.
Yes, they look great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so my name is Katie. I work in Miami. I've been down in Miami about 7 years, originally from New England. And my background is in environmental science and also in urban planning. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we're dealing with here in Miami, and they're really applicable to all of Southeast Florida. I work for the county, which is a pretty large organization. We have about 3 million people in our sort of general metro area, and sea level rise is obviously front and center for us. So our kind of organizing strategy to deal with sea level rise is you can find on our website, but we really orient that strategy around our landscape. We have these different areas in our landscape, which I'll talk about more, but just as a kind of orientation, this is the community where we're talking about today. We've got barrier islands like our famous Miami Beach and our seaport, our airport in the inland areas, a lot of suburban development on the inland areas. And then these patches of brown are what we call our ridge or the high ground. We have Everglades National Park and Biscayne National Park also within our community. So we have you can see this satellite image at night. We have sort of two coasts in our area. We have the Atlantic coast, and you can see the Bahamas just off there.
Okay, for Pete's sake, come on, what's happening?
We also have the Everglades, which is in the inland area. So the Everglades is sort of a second coast for us. And if you haven't visited or seen it, it's this extensive wetland ecosystem called the River of Grass that stretches from North and Central Florida all the way down to the Florida Keys. So this area is really rich in terms of ecological value, but also very wet. We get in the summertime, we have a dry and wet season. And in the summertime, we can get afternoon rains, or with a tropical storm, where we get 8 or 10 inches at once. So it can be quite a lot of rain in a short amount of time. And one of the other things that that creates a sort of shallow wetland ecosystem across a very extensive area. But one of the other things is that because we have a pronounced dry season, there's also the risk of fires in the dry season. And so around the turn of the century, there was a perception that this natural system that was here with wet, at times the wet season, there was too much water, and in the dry season, not enough water. And so there was a large public works project to redesign the water management system. So draining the swamp started here. So the Army Corps of Engineers, in concert with others here locally, set about a process to try and create channels throughout the Everglades to bring down the water levels in the Everglades in order to facilitate development. So they dredged through the wetland areas like you can see here. And these areas, like where these pictures are taken, this is not far from where the Miami International Airport is today. So you can see kind of what we had as a starting condition, not that high above the water, not that dry in the wet season. And that's kind of the foundation that we're built upon. So they set about sort of straightening the meandering creeks, which you can see in the background, and all of that to facilitate the development, in some cases appropriating that land from the Native Americans who are here, but looking at trying to create agricultural and residential and vacation homes out of what was a large wetland ecosystem. So what we've inherited today is this very vast network of canals and detention areas. And here you can see a control structure and pumping structure that all moves our water, sort of man-managed system, moving our water between different basins and between different areas constantly to try and minimize flood risks and sort of balance our water needs across the whole landscape. I'll skip some of these slides, but basically we did have a system where the water flowed from north to south in sort of a sheet flow across a wide area. And now, as I say, it's very managed, going through certain canals and waterways at different times of the year. One of the other big transformations that happened down here is what we call cut and fill. So essentially dredging material like sand or aggregate from one area. We have these mines out in the west that then are used to create sort of fill areas that are the platforms for development. So here you can see that the Everglades is in the background here, and then across this highway, there's been development using this technique of cut and fill. And all that is to say is that the city has really transformed an area that looked a little bit like this into what is now a very dense urban area. But the urban area that we sit on is just a few feet, in some cases inches, above the groundwater table. And so when we have a lot of rain, there's not a lot of space for that rain to be absorbed. So looking at it sideways, this is kind of what our landscape looks like. We've got this coastal area, which is lower lying. We've got an area of high ground, and then a vast area of low lying land that's out facing the Everglades. And we sit on top of our drinking water resources, which is the Biscayne Aquifer, and that interacts with our saltwater as well. And so with sea level rise, that's also affecting our drinking water resources. So when we look at it from the top, we look at which areas of ours are at risk of sea level rise. It's not just these, which you can see in these blue areas on the right. It's not just the coastal areas that are at risk. We have these areas inland, sometimes a little bit out of the limelight, that are also at risk. So for us, it's not really just a coastal issue, it's for our whole community. And that relates because of our, like I was saying, kind of our history, the way we develop, but also the topography. So this topography map, which shows the elevation on the left, shows these areas of high ground in brown and red. And then you can see the blue colors are lower lying, closer to sea level. And those are obviously on our barrier islands, but also in areas like place just north of our airport or communities that are out west. So when we look forward into the sea level rise that we expect in the future, some of the maps can be a little dramatic. So, you know, we have the potential for much of our community to be inundated with sea level rise. So our sea level rise strategy is how we plan to respond to that. And it's really framed around the landscape like I was talking about, and breaking the community down into these different areas, whether you face the Atlantic coast or whether you face the sort of Everglades, or if you're in the high ground in the middle. And so each of our approaches is kind of tailored to where you are, because the risks of flooding are really different depending on where you're sitting. But one of the things that really unites all of it is that as we have a slight rise in the sea on the coast, it kind of ripples through our whole system. We see the groundwater rise just along the coast in a 1-to-1 ratio, but it also affects that whole canal network and means that our canals aren't draining in the same way they were designed to when the Army Corps of Engineers built them. One of the other challenges that we have here is that we have a really porous ground. And so unlike New Orleans or the Netherlands, where they could use levees to try and keep the water out, we can't use walls or levees in the same way because we have this porous ground where the groundwater can seep underneath them and sort of seek its own level over time. So we have to kind of learn to live with the water. That's one of our unique conditions here. So we have kind of 5 big approaches that we're taking to adapt to sea level rise. One of them is to build up, like we say, like the Florida Keys, so kind of up on stilts and kind of a coastal approach to being able to handle storms when they come through. Another approach is to keep going with what Florida has done and build up on fill, which has some downsides, but also a lot of precedent. Another thing is to kind of concentrate development along the high ground where we have it. And then really importantly, everywhere, look for, where can we have more space for water with green infrastructure or shell driveways or other little spaces where we can hold that water. And then on a bigger scale, looking where ways and blue ways to help be a buffer against the storms that do come. So we work as a region to create our sea level rise projections, which we use for planning, which are shown here. But generally speaking, when we're talking to the public, we're talking about a foot of sea level rise by 2040, 2050, and about 2 feet, hopefully later, but probably around 2060, 2070. We've already seen about 10 inches of rise, just for context. So in our case, one of those big challenges is that a lot of the impacts are kind of out of sight, out of mind. They're below our feet as our groundwater changes. It changes seasonally with the dry season and the wet season, with the groundwater getting higher after we have a couple months of rain. But also with sea level, it's changing the average. So our average condition is a little bit higher over time. So this has led to a couple different impacts. So one is when we have that higher groundwater table, we don't have as much space to absorb the rain. So a couple years ago, we got an unseasonal amount of rain in December. And so that had a big impact on some of our agricultural lands, which, just didn't have the drainage capacity there. We also can see in our residential area, this is some flooding we had in 2020 after a tropical storm. There's just that water can stick around for a while because our drainage network isn't as good. This is a picture of the direct tidal flooding that we get during king tide. You can see kind of creeping into this industrial site. And then this is a picture along one of our canals. And you can probably notice that the yards that are on either side aren't that much higher than the canal. So this is kind of one of the big challenges that we have, is that when it rains, we just don't have a lot of capacity left in many of those canals to hold more water, to let the water run off. And it's a big challenge. It's difficult to explain to residents very fairly. They think that this is a drainage issue, and it's really difficult to explain that canal is at the same level as the ocean, and we're kind of limited in our ability to bring that water level down. And understandably, that's very frustrating. So it can also be difficult to explain that the kind of flooding that we see even far inland is related to what we're seeing on the coast. So this is pictures from that same tropical storm. It's really far from the coast. And again, you see that when we have that rain, it just takes a while for it to be able to move off the landscape, and obviously leads to impacts as well, even in places that are far from the coast. So this, I'll just skip this one more time and just say that, one of the things that we have here, which I mentioned a couple of times, that all of our water system is really interconnected. And so as we think about how to respond to sea level rise, kind of have to think about the whole system as one system and how it works together. And one of the challenges that we have is that the system was created as the Central and Southern Flood Control District. So the intention behind creating the system in the 40s and 50s and 60s was to, like I was saying before, try and draw down water levels, get the water off the landscape in order to have dry ground for housing and agriculture and other things. And over time, folks came to realize that there were some negatives associated with draining the Everglades, obviously the ecological impacts. And so the district changed its name from the flood control district to the water management district to also reflect its sort of broader mission as well of trying to manage water for drinking and for ecological value as well. But we still really have a challenge, and you've probably seen some of the stories in the news that as the water is pushed off the landscape in order to manage flooding, we have had red tide blooms, we've had algal blooms and fish kills, and obviously just because we're so urban, we also have a lot of pollution that just comes from folks everyday kind of trash ending up in these big conveyance systems and then going out to the bay. So we do have one of the big challenges here is kind of we have these two things. Obviously, we want clean water at the coast. That's a huge part of why people move to Florida, why people visit Florida. So that's really key to us. But we do also have this system that was designed to move water off the landscape and manage flooding. And of course, we have to manage flooding as well. That's also key. So we see one of the reasons that we have a lot of momentum to address these challenges here is that you can see the impacts that the sea level rise is having already. So it's impacting our roadways. This is a roadway, right? There's a fire station right there on the corner. It's affecting our parks and some of our downtown areas. We obviously have buildings right on the coast, and you can see the change in the tides, and then our boat ramps and other areas like that tend to be impacted as well. And so for many of our residents, regardless of kind of their backgrounds, some of the impacts are really obvious, and that really helps build a momentum to take action. One of the other things that is really driving the momentum is that we have a lot of septic systems that are right along the coast. So this you can see is a canal. People have their boats right in the canal. And this is king tide flooding over the top, and it's coming into the street and then into the yard. And this is a house with a septic system. The whole area is on septic systems. And you can see when the king tide flooding comes in, we have black water in the driveway. And obviously that's bad for the bay in terms of nutrients and fish kills, but it's also a public health issue as we have undertreated wastewater mixing with the surface water, and if folks are driving through it or getting out of their car or walking their dog or whatever, that's the real challenge for us. The other big impetus for why there's so much action is being taken is that we've really been in the spotlight, both from like real estate news, from business news, being the poster child for these impacts, and it's so that amount of attention I think is not typically welcome. There's a strong desire from business leaders, from community leaders to show that, we're not just going to be the next Atlantis, and that we're really taking this seriously and trying to stay a step ahead. But again, that is a big push for us, all the attention that we get from business and from our rating agencies and from developers and for the banks and the insurance companies that support the developers, asking tough questions about what we're doing on this front. So that's how that's one of the big fuels in the fire. So the good news is that there is a lot that is happening. So for example, we just published a report that's looking at the progress that's been made. So one of the things that I'm working on with colleagues is we created this planning project called Adaptation Action Areas, where we zoom in to one of the areas that's really at risk of flooding and work with the community to try and identify projects that we can do. Fortunately, this was really successful, so we were able to get about 50 million this year to do things like connect the homes to the sewer system, update housing, improve the stormwater system, and raise the canal banks, and a couple other things that are happening in that area. Another thing that we're working on is also changing our codes. So we can see in a lot of places that our seawalls are too low. So we're working through code changes to update those so that they stay a little higher than our high tides. Another thing that's happening in partnership with the federal government is protecting, adding more sand to our beaches. So, this is sort of like a heavy industry picture. Obviously, the beach is closed while this work is happening, but once the backhoes leave and the sand is placed, it's obviously a great amenity, as well as providing like a critical buffer for us during storms and during hurricanes, sort of that punching bag that absorbs all the energy from the waves and really protects the community that's behind. So we've got a couple $100 million going into our beaches as well. One of the other things that we're working on is also acquiring some of our undeveloped lands. This is an area down in South Dade, and you can see there's some development here on the coast and a park and a marina, but behind it, there's the community of Homestead in Florida City. But between the city and the coast, there's this pretty large area of undeveloped lands. And so we're working to acquire those so that we can keep that buffer. This is one of the areas that was really hard hit from Hurricane Andrew. And fortunately, the communities that were further inland were really protected by having this wide area of wetlands and mangroves, again, to help kind of absorb some of the energy that came with that hurricane. The other thing that we're doing is working a lot with charrettes and community meetings, because there's really no silver bullet. Unfortunately, we don't have any one thing that will really help us not have to worry about sea level rise. So we have to think about, what do our residents want to see in these neighborhoods? How do they want their neighborhood to change over time? And so we try really hard to use visuals and icons and just photos to try and elicit some of that feedback, so we can get some direction about the best way to move ahead in different areas. So with that, I'll stop, and we can maybe turn it over to discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There was a lot of information you provided there, all with pictures. That was fantastic for you to narrate that for us. I'm intrigued with a couple of things. So I might just start with a couple of questions here, and just a reminder to our audience that you can present questions or comments in the chat section, please. And first question is, you mentioned in one of your earlier slides about green and blue neighborhoods. I was wondering if you could just explain to us what green and blue neighborhoods are, and if that is a part of a particular initiative, and what does that include?
Yeah, so one of the things that we have here, which I think I mentioned, is that basically we live in a subtropical environment, so we can get a lot of rain, and part of making it comfy to be here is so that we can manage those tropical rains when they do come. And so, to some extent, we have an, let's say, a public stormwater system. Like we'll have French drains or maybe other stormwater infrastructure that's in the street. But usually that stormwater infrastructure is designed to hold a 5 or a 10 or maybe a 25-year storm event, which makes sense from a cost perspective, but is not necessarily enough to keep things dry and navigable, especially as we sometimes get heavier rains than we did in the past. So what we're trying to do is create a system where we can hold water and manage water across a lot of different spaces, not just the public road, so that we can use driveways and parks and lawns and other places like that to help us manage rainwater. The idea is not that any one person's driveway can manage it all, but that hopefully by having this network of permeable surfaces, that we can kind of reduce the pressure on the public infrastructure, and also, like, say, create a lot of nice spaces as well. There are a lot of really beautiful examples that we have here with courtyards, and as you guys have in Texas as well, but using shell and using other materials, gravel and things like that help create more permeable surfaces. But it's also, for us, really helpful for the heat as well. So having trees and bushes and things like that helps us manage the heat as well. Having a lot of plants can also reduce how fast the water runs off. So, if we have a fully paved parking lot, when that rain hits, it 100% basically turns off into runoff. If we intersperse in the parking lot with medians, with trees and with bushes, then those plants can help smooth out that curve a little bit, so that not all the water runs off right away. Some of it's held in place, maybe some of it evaporates back up off the leaves. And so that's really helpful for us. Fortunately, we have a very lush environment here. So a lot of plants do really well. So you think that's also, when we go to public meetings, usually the most popular approach. People really like the idea of gardens and lush public spaces. So that tends to be something that's pretty popular when we talk to folks about it.
Great. Thank you for that. In your introduction, you kind of set the stage and the context for us, where you explained the historic land uses. You had the wonderful photos there, and then described the process over time in which the land use had changed in those particular areas. And I found that to be really interesting, as in Texas, our land use and development is fairly sparse in our coastal zone, especially compared to the examples you shared there for the Miami-Dade area. So our change and our development is in the early stages from where perhaps we might be, let's say 20, 50, and 100 years from now. So we have a lot of area that's left undeveloped. But I did see some other similarities in the proximity to the water table. And certainly communities are experiencing inundation and infiltration of their sewage treatment, their conveyance, as well as stormwater. In For your community, and I don't know if this was during your tenure or before your time, but was there an aha moment, or did something occur? Was there a big event or a catalyst that all of a sudden, created the impetus for we need to address this and changes in our policy? Or was there some kind of a precipitating event that really got people's attention?
I think one of the things that I think helped move things along faster was, I think, because of different factors, we went from having just 1 or 2 or 3 king tides a year to one year having like 15 or more than that in some cases. So in 2015, there was this big jump in how frequent the king tides were. And that really alarmed a lot of folks. And then we had more king tides as well in the subsequent years. And that also, the water speaks to a big number of people. People who are just driving to their house or driving, they don't need to be tuned in necessarily to notice because we're so close to the water. A lot of people notice. One of the other things that we had was we had a pretty large public protest that we weren't doing enough to address sea level rise in the following year. So we had a lot of kids show up to our budget hearing, county budget hearing, in life jackets and with talkie points. And I'll say that they made a really big impression. I think in part because they're high school. A lot of the kids that were speaking were high school students, and they were really upset at the idea that the place that they grew up would go underwater, and that we weren't taking enough action to go underwater, to prevent that from going underwater. So that was a big impetus at the county level for allocating more time and attention and more visibility to taking action on sea level rise. So that was one of the kind of catalytic events, was dozens of kids in life jackets complaining very loudly. So that really helped tip the scales. But like I said, I think what has probably been more impactful in terms of sustaining and encouraging the investment and proactivity is the pressure that comes from the investment community, from the banking community, from the insurance community, from our rating agencies. That is, again, a sustained and constant question that we get. And so that also, I think, makes it pretty clearly, there's a pretty clear consensus across the whole political spectrum that we need to take action. So this last year, the legislature allocated $500 million for coastal resilience projects, and and that's in a very conservative political environment.
But and Katherine, did I understand you said the king tides that you referenced were in 2015, so just 7 years ago?
Yeah.
Okay, that's,
Yeah.
y'all made a lot of remarkable progress in a fairly short period of time.
Well, there was work happening before then. I don't mean to say that that was the beginning, but I think that scaled up the pace. There was
Mhm.
definitely work happening before then, but yeah, that was, yeah, it's not just the last 7 years. There's been a lot of work going into it, but that's when things kind of changed.
Okay. And what I'd like to do is invite Brian to assist with some of the Q&A portion. As a reminder to participants, if you could please include any comments or questions in the chat box. Also, Aspen, if you could please unpin Katherine so we could see the participant list, and also Brian's video and mine in this next section. Brian, are you ready?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. And Katie, before dive into some of the chat's questions, I wanted to ask if there's been any long-term or effects that you've noticed. You showed a slide of changing from a flood control district to a water management district. Because of that, is there any lasting, I guess, way people look at things, or you guys get pushed back on things because of, like you said, from drainage and flooding to now managing an entire system? Or I guess making that, or as conveying that difference to the public, has that been any sort of challenge?
Well, I think that Florida's kind of interesting place, but I mean, I would imagine there are parallels a lot to Texas, but people really value clean water, and so for us, because the negative impacts of water quality have been so visible. We had like a large king tide event, really heartbreaking images of whale sharks washing up on the shore, or baby manatees being orphaned next to, just really heartbreaking scenes. And so there's pretty wide consensus about the importance of trying to clean up our water. One of the other things too is that the Florida Keys is where we have a lot of visitors. We also have a lot of fishermen down there, professional commercial fishermen or charter fishermen. And they've been really vocal about, because of all those changes that have been happening, the bay down in Florida Bay has been not as healthy. The seagrass, the fisheries, all that has been impacted. And so the fishermen have been super vocal about sending clean water south. And again, I think it really spans the whole political spectrum. People really want clean water. One of the challenges is maybe sometimes making the connection between how we get clean water in such an urban and growing place is hard, so sometimes it's hard to explain. I use the example of septic systems, and they're definitely impacting our water quality. And I think, again, people can understand we don't want to have sewage going into the bay or into our streets, but then we have over 120,000 septic systems. So that's a $4 billion problem. And we can't just solve that right away, so we're kind of chipping away at it. But so I don't think that we have pushback in the sense, I think we have a lot of support, but we do sometimes struggle with the specific steps, like getting funding for the sewer system, or getting, getting the money to move some of those things forward. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, and a lot of that rings home for me. I still live in the Florida Keys, and they were transitioning over to sewage for about a year and a half while I lived down there on the key I was on. So we're going to jump into some questions from chat now. Doug Jacobson asks, are the streets and highways being replaced with permeable surfaces?
The short answer is no. But I think that's a great idea. I think that we have, I'm sure like you all, different agencies that control different roadways. So we have, state and county and local roads. So one area that we've thought about doing it is on local roads, like residential streets. Is it possible to have a permeable road bed? So try and, still have a hard paved top, but underneath have like more of a French drain kind of system so that water can flow underneath it. Because in some places we have really low lying roads. And if we raise the road, we could inadvertently create a sort of impoundment, a sort of barrier to water, which we don't want to create. So some of the brainstorming that's been going on is, is there a way to make the roadbed itself not a barrier to water, and maybe even help us store some water? But by and large, not really moving away from traditional surfaces on our roadways, but certainly looking at where we can do that in parking lots, in driveways, and other spaces like that don't have as much pressure on them.
All right, and he continued on with asking, what is the public understanding and support for these initiatives? I guess if you have initiatives that people understand better, or not, if you want to give a little bit of a little deeper dive into that.
Sure. Yeah, I think that we're lucky in the sense that, like I said, a lot of our community understands why we're doing these things. So that's good. But we do still encounter, like everywhere, kind of the educational challenge that comes with explaining why we need to do specific public works projects or construction projects. Understandably, people really do not want construction on their street. Like Brian was just mentioning, it's a headache, takes a long time, it's disruptive, it's expensive. So that's one of the main challenges is managing that and hopefully getting people on board with it. But in general, we have pretty broad support for a lot of this work.
All right, yeah, given some of those very graphic footage, I'm pretty sure one had someone shoveling buckets of water into a canal that was also dumping right back into their yard. So
yeah.
I've got another question for Maureen asking, are the standards in blue neighborhoods required or incentivized?
So it's a mix. So we have certain requirements that commercial sites need, like let's say I have a pharmacy or a Walmart. That commercial site is going to need to retain a stormwater on site. So they'll have to retain a 25-year storm, so a certain number of inches of rain. And so the traditional way that that's done down here in Florida does use gravel trenches, we call French drains underground, or maybe stormwater detention areas like grassy depressions usually to hold the stormwater. And so in those cases, it'd be required, they have to retain the stormwater on site. We don't have the same kind of requirements for single family homes or small apartment buildings. So in those cases, it's generally just an incentive, just a best practice. We do have our agricultural extension office does a good job of going out and doing, rain barrel workshops and rain garden planting workshops and things like that. So they try and educate through we have a master gardeners group and try and get the word out through those folks. But right now, especially for residential areas, it's just incentives at the moment.
All right, and have there been any concerns about property value impacts associated with the designation of a blue area?
Well, yeah, so that's a good question. So we do not have any designated blue areas. So I think maybe I'll just share a story. So before I moved down here, worked really closely with a bunch of folks from New Orleans. And those of you that are familiar with the situation after Katrina, there was a miscommunication, but also a lot of pushback on this idea that there would be these green areas where they would have reduced density. And there was a perception that was telling certain folks that they needed to leave or, and that's definitely not the case here, and definitely not the impression that we want to convey. So that we don't have any areas that we have designated for retreat or reduced density or things like that, except for a couple cases where we have existing rules in place, like the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, or we have something here called the Coastal CCL, which I forget what it stands for, but Coastal Construction Control Line or something. We do have some rules in place like that. The coastal high hazard area is another. These are state or federal laws that trying to make sure that we don't overdevelop in these areas on barrier islands and other places that are really at risk from hurricane damage. But generally speaking, for our developed areas, haven't demarcated any areas on the map as this kind of zone or anything like that. I talked about the adaptation action area, and that is a designation that we have, a specific area where we focused on addressing issue. It's a very low-lying area, some places not even above sea level, just a few inches above our high tides. So we focused on that, but the intention when we did that was to try and identify what are the challenges, and then also can we bring in resources. So like I said, with the septic systems, brought in funding for the sewer connection, and have brought in funding to update some of the housing. And so in that case, the intention was to bring in infrastructure to address the challenges. Very fair question though, should we maybe think about doing something else, like maybe stepping back from those really low-lying areas? And that's definitely a conversation. But we have here a lot of things happening at the same time. So here we've had a lot of people move to Miami since the pandemic, and our housing prices in some areas have almost doubled. So preserving housing and affordable housing and not having people have to move is also a goal that we have in the community. So we kind of just have to balance these things, even though sometimes they're in a little bit of tension. But ideally, we want to make sure that all of our residents have access to functioning wastewater, safe housing, and be close to jobs and schools that they want to go to. So we kind of have to fit all those pieces together, which definitely isn't the easiest.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the detailed explanation there. And I'd imagine probably trying to designate a blue area, if you've ever seen an aerial of Florida, it's just like you showed the building on fill, so all that around that is all technically blue. So yeah, that'd be quite a hard designation. And you kind of answered the next question in chat. It's from Juan Moy. It goes, how's prolonged inundation issues affecting the value of real estate?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because I and I think many people thought, if we see this kind of recurrent king tide flooding in some of our coastal neighborhoods, so that might depress property values. That would be what you would expect, right? Like the house is flooded, the road to get there is flooded, and that's not at all what we've seen in let me qualify that and say, in wealthy coastal areas where waterfront property is a real premium. We have counterintuitively seen property values really skyrocket over the last 5 years. So as of right now, we're not seeing a negative impact on property values due to that kind of king tide flooding. One of the things I know from other places where I've worked is that that's not the case necessarily as you go into different demographics, like different types of neighborhoods. So if you are, I'll just take my family as an example, if we were to buy a house, that house would be most of our wealth. We wouldn't have the ability to just rebuild the seawall or rebuild the septic system or just kind of write those checks. So if we started to see impacts, we would be in a kind of middle group that would probably say, this is starting to get expensive. Maybe we should sell this house and move to someplace where it's a little cheaper for us. We have though where folks either can afford to make those changes without necessarily having it impact their decision making. Maybe in a lot of cases we see people tearing down houses and just building totally new, and so the cost of a seawall or the septic system is small for them. And then on the other hand, we have folks that have struggled to afford to be able to move at all. So it kind of really hits differently depending on your family situation.
And just to follow up on that. So with an influx of wealth into those communities, are any of those folks driving some of that change and some of that funding that's going into these systems to work with? If it's if they're getting king tides, they're like, hey, who's addressing this? What are we doing? And using some of that money they have to do that.
Yeah, I definitely, I think there's a lot of pressure to take action, and those residents that are impacted are definitely very vocal advocates for taking action. We haven't yet seen, or to my knowledge, haven't seen a lot of examples of privately funded public improvements. There's a lot of privately funded improvements, like raising a house or raising a seawall, connecting to the sewer system that is kind of on people's property line. One of the ideas that's been floated, but I don't think has happened yet, is perhaps having some kind of public-private partnership to raise a street, for example, in an area. So we haven't seen that quite yet, but that's definitely an idea that's been floated.
Right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in chat at the moment, so I'm gonna pass this back along to Jason to wrap things up.
Thank you so much, Brian. Ms. Hagemann, the information you've shared with us has been really insightful, especially as y'all been kind of walking down this pathway for quite some time and being forced to respond to the impacts around you. We really do appreciate you spending time with us here in Texas and sharing your expertise and some of the lessons learned. We'll definitely be visiting some of the documents that you shared in the future. I did share a couple of links in the chat if folks are interested in learning more about the Clean Coast Texas menu of services and how we might be able to assist your community in improving the management of non-point source pollution. And there's also a link that addresses water quality and sea level rise from a recent publication. Clean Coast Texas and the Texas General Land Office would like to thank you for joining us today. I'd like to thank Texas State University Meadows Center for Water and the Environment for helping us to host today. So thank you very much. Everyone have a fabulous day. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.